The wire sings like a saw. He's 40, alone, setting a second mug anyway. She falls from a spent mare. Men in clean gloves come grinning with paper and iron. Ash becomes a curtain. Snow drops the roof. Cuffs bite. By dawn, ink wins. And two white breaths agree to share the cold till spring. The wind came down off the high ridges like a saw, biting the paint off anything foolish enough to face it. Silas Boone eased the door in against that push, shoulder to plank, and felt the cold climb his coat as if it had hands. The hinge didn't squeal. He'd worked mutton tallow into it that morning with the point of his knife, so the cabin closed on silence and the soft tick of the iron stove. He set his hat crown down, shook snow from the brim. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. And stood a moment in the gray light. The place smelled of wool, coffee, and saddle soap. On the table sat two enamel mugs. One chipped, his, the other whole, clean, waiting. He didn't look at it long. He reached for the coffee pot, black and nicked, and poured steady. The telegraph wire out on the ridge had been singing all afternoon, wind on bronze, a high, thin whine that found its way through chinks and into a man's molars. Folks in town said only operators could hear code in it. Silas heard weather, hard weather, set to take what it wanted. He drank and went about the small work that keeps a life from freezing. He tapped ash from the stove, raked coals, laid on split pine. He checked the rawhide thongs that held the window patch tight, tightened them another notch. He rubbed a smear of tallow along the door's worn sill so it would lift clean without a cry. The chores were quiet, the kind you could do in the dark by feel. He had learned to do most things by feel. Outside, cattle bunched in the draw, hides roughed up, tails to the wind. The big die-up, the papers called it. Silas didn't read much, but he knew what it meant to the small outfits. Calves lost, cows ribbed down, men slipping into debt like a boot into slush. He had counted his hay twice. He would count it again before full dark. He pulled on his gloves and stepped back out long enough to check the windmill. The vane shuddered, a tired bird against the gale, and the pump rod ticked in the well throat. He listened, palm on the timbers. It would hold if the gusts stayed steady. If they chopped, the whole tower would rock itself to kindling. He patted it like a spine and told it what he told himself. Hold. The flats beyond Snowshoe Creek were white, not soft white, but hard, like salt. The only color was the black seam of willows along the cut bank, and the red of his own knuckles where the cold had split them. He followed his boot holes to the east pasture to look in on a cow that had calved too late for kindness. The calf lay stiff as a post, lashes white with rime, small mouth rimed in milk that never quite warmed. He stood there a minute, the wind pressing his coat to his ribs, and felt something tight in his chest that wasn't the cold. He pulled the little body out of the drift and laid brush over it to keep coyotes off. The cow bawled once, a sound like a gate hinge, and went to the hay. Back at the cabin, he stripped off his gloves and held his hands to the stove. Skin burned, then itched as blood argued with heat. He took the knife again, sliced a curl from a cake of tallow, and worked it into a boot seam where the stitching had gone dry. A man kept things going or they came apart. It was true of leather. It was true of a roof. It was true of whatever a man had left in him. At 40, if he aimed to see spring grass. He set the second mug a little closer to the coffee. He didn't pick it up. He only eased it nearer, as if warmth could jump the gap all by itself. "Another breath in this house," he said under his breath, not praying exactly, but not fooling himself either. The wire sang louder toward dusk. Snow came in flats, then in sift, filling his tracks as fast as he made them. He checked the latch again, and pushed a rag into the crack where the north wind found its way. He laid his coat over the chairback so the frost on it could smoke off. He ate from the pan, sopping the last gravy with a heel of bread, and listened to the wood pop inside the stove like someone walking away on the other side of a wall. He took his mother's Bible down, not to read, his eyes tired quick in that light, but to hold. The leather was smooth where years of fingers had polished it. "Keep your head down, keep your knitting clean," she told him, son, and then she died in a spring that came late and mean. He set the book back and stood a long time with his hand on the shelf. The wind shifted toward full dark. You could hear it swing like a door coming round from the west to strike the cabin square. The telegraph wire climbed a note and held it, thin as a saw blade. Somewhere out there the creek ice popped and settled. He filled the lamp, trimmed the wick, and leaned to catch the flame. Light took hold slow, then steadied. Silas picked up the chipped mug, then the other, clean one. He set them side by side. "Maybe," he said to no one, and the word made a small cloud in the cold room before the stove got ahead of it. He washed both anyway, dried both, and left them mouth down on the towel like two hats on a bench. When he blew the lamp down to a softer glow, the wire's song ran thin as a hair along the edge of night. He lay on his bunk with his boots off and his coat over his blanket, listening to the wind tell what it meant to do to men in fences. He closed his eyes to keep the room where it was. Out past the ridge, winter moved. In here a stove held, a door kept shut, and a man with tallow on his fingers waited, without saying so, for one more breath, not his own. The sound came thin through the wind's teeth, hooves missing their rhythm. Silas was on his feet before he knew he'd moved. Lamp turned low with a thumb, coat shrugged on. He lifted the latch and pushed into the white. Snow ran flat and hard to the fence line. A bay mare came out of the drift, like a bad idea, legs splaying, nostrils crusted with salt white. She tried to jump the bottom rail, missed, and folded sideways. The rider pitched forward, caught the post with a shoulder, and hit the ground with no give in it. "Easy," Silas said to the cold, more than to them. He was at the girl's side in 6 strides, breath hauling steam, city clothes, wool not meant for this, a skirt torn high where it met a half-frozen boot. Her hat was gone. A cut at the hairline had bled and then turned black with frost. She was small under the coat, smaller in the snow. He slid an arm under her shoulders and another at her knees. Weight like a sack of flour, but warmer. She stirred once, said nothing. He carried her inside with his hip to the door. The hinge stayed quiet. The stove heat moved slow across the room to meet them. He laid her on the bunk, rolled a blanket, and set it under the knees to lift them, the way the old army surgeon had done for shock. He took his knife, split a strip from a clean wool scarf, and set it to the cut with his palm pressed gentle. The blood made a penny smell. He held until the seeping slowed. The mare gave a single hoof thud against the wall, then nothing. He went back out, knelt at her head, and pulled the bridle clear so she wouldn't choke if she tried to rise. She didn't. He patted her neck once, quick. The wind took the heat off his glove in a breath. Under the eave, a slab of roof snow groaned and settled a thumb. The sound was a warning the way a rattler is a warning. Silas grabbed a cedar post from the woodpile and jammed it under the low corner of the porch. Shoulder braced, boots slipping, until the cut end bit. The beam held. The slab stayed put. For now. Inside, he stoked the stove and set a pan for water. He poured coffee into the clean enamel mug without thinking, then thought of it and kept going. He set it in her hands and worked her fingers around it, one by one. They were stiff and thin, the nails neat, city neat. "Drink if you can, ma'am," he said. The word came right this time. Steam ran across her cheek and made a wet print. Her lashes twitched. He warmed mutton tallow between his palms and dabbed it on the split at her lip and the wind burned patches along her cheekbones. The smell, lanolin and smoke, filled the small room. He worked a rusty safety pin out of the tin and used it to catch the scarf ends, then wrapped another strip round her wrist, where a bruise was coming up like dusk. She shivered hard. He pulled the blanket over, tucked it at shoulder and hip, then hesitated at the buttons of her soaked glove. The leather clung. He set his jaw, worked it loose, careful, and slid the glove off. Her hand was not much bigger than his palm. He rubbed life back into it with the heel of his thumb, slow, counting under his breath, the way he did to steady a skittish colt. Color came by degrees. She blinked, eyes unfocused first, then on him. "Where is this?" The voice was rough silk. "Snowshoe Creek," he said. "My place. Storm seen. You're safe." She looked past him toward the door, as if measuring the miles with her eyes. Then she saw the coffee. He lifted it to her again. Careful. She took it, both hands. The mug knocked once against a tooth before she steadied. A sip, another, some heat crept back into her face. "I won't be trouble," she said, voice low, eastern edges on the vowels. "One night's shelter, I'll work it off." "That's not a trade I'm making," he said. "You'll stay till you're fit." Her mouth made a small, stubborn line at that, but she nodded. She tried to shift up on an elbow and hissed when her shoulder spoke against it. He pressed 2 fingers to the blanket by her collarbone. "Don't." Outside, the wind swung and shouldered the cabin again. The roof slab creaked back at it, long and mean, like a held breath. Silas stood, listened to the weight above them, and set another log on the fire. The wire out on the ridge sang one thin note through the wall. He glanced at the door, then at the clean mug, empty on her knee, and felt the room change in a way a man can't name, only feel in his bones when cold begins to lose. By morning the storm had shaved itself down to a steady hiss against the chinks. The roof slab held. The stove kept its end of the bargain. When Silas set the coffee pot back, the girl's eyes were open and clearer. "You took a spill," he said. "Name if you care to give it." "Lila Davenport." She tested the syllables like a chipped tooth, then nodded once. "Thank you for not letting me freeze." "Ain't a thing to thank," he said, then heard his own tongue and tried again. "Ma'am." It came out flat. Her mouth tugged, not quite a smile. "Say it like you mean the respect, not the distance." He cleared his throat. "Ma'am." Better, she pushed herself up, careful of the shoulder. The blanket slid enough to show the wet wool at her collar. He looked away and busied his hands with the stove, shaving pine curls off a split with his knife, the curls falling bright as coin into his palm. Fire took quick to them, licking up with a clean smell. He set the kettle nearer and let the little noises of a working morning fill the room. When he turned back, she was studying him over the rim of the mug. He met her eyes and held. It felt like holding a skittish horse, steady, patient, not too tight. "There," she said soft. "That's it." He lasted to 6 heartbeats before his gaze tried to slip to the safe ground of her hands. He dragged it back and felt heat creep into his ears. She set the mug down, fingers splayed to show they were only hands, nothing more dangerous than that. "Show me that neckerchief knot," she said, glancing at the scarf drying by the stove. "The wind will have me if I—" "Don't learn it." He took the scarf and folded it once, twice, thumb slow. "You lay it like a band," he said, voice settling as the cloth did what it always did. "Cross over, tuck under, pull flat so it don't choke when you move." Like so, he looped it easy, left a little give under the throat. "Room to breathe." She leaned in so he could set it right. His knuckles brushed the hollow at the base of her neck, a warm place the storm hadn't reached, and his hand trembled before he could tell it not to. He set the hand back on his thigh as if that had been the plan. Room to breathe, she echoed, fingers finding the knot, testing its truth. You do your work quiet, mister. Boone, Silas will do, he said, then because he needed practice. Ma'am. Wind found the wire on the ridge and drew a long, thin note from it. She cocked her head, listening. You hear that? She asked. Been singing since yesterday. It isn't a telegraph, she said, but it tells on itself. She tapped the table with one finger. Quick, quick, slow, quick. In the office, we call that a word. Dots and dashes. Wind makes a kind of false code. It fools folks who want to be fooled. You read the real kind. I do. She lifted her hand, then let it fall. I did. The kettle boiled. He poured. She took the second mug, the clean one he'd kept meaning for someone, and wrapped her fingers around it like it was a small animal come in from the cold. Ma'am, he said again, letting it sit right this time. She laughed under her breath, a thread of sound the room hadn't held in years. Later, when the light widened to a pale pewter, she asked for air. He set his coat over her shoulders and opened the door just long enough to steal a look at the world. Snow lay to the fence like pressed wool. The bay mare made a low shape under brush. He'd lay her in the drift proper when the wind eased. Lila's gaze snagged on a sliver of wood stuck through the fence wire. Not a twig. A stake shaved square with a rag of red cloth frozen to it. She stepped no farther. Her city boots weren't built for that, but she lifted a finger. That isn't your doing. No. She stared a second longer, eyes narrowing the way a telegrapher narrows at a faint line. Survey, she said. Railroad men marked like that. Numbers on the face if you scrape the frost. She swallowed. I must have passed others and didn't see. The dark. The fall. Silas reached past her and pulled the door to, snug against the weather. The stove welcomed them back with a lick of heat. He set the bar and stood a beat too long with his hand on it. You know their ways, he said. I know enough to wish I didn't. She drew the coat tighter, the scarf knot snug under her chin. If they want something here, they'll come with papers and men who smile when they steal. Or they'll send worse. He thought of the wires singing and the little calf gone to iron, of the clean steak with its tidy strip of red. He set his jaw and checked the latch again. You'll take broth, he said, because a man had to start somewhere. Then we'll make a list. Hinges to grease, boards to quiet, little things. She met his eyes, a 4 count this time, and he held on the 5th. Little things, she agreed. Those are what keep a place standing. Miguel Ortega showed just after noon, sorrel roached with ice, breath making ropes in the air. He swung down without a word, and pointed with his chin toward the corral. Silas took his coat and followed. The snow there held a story even wind couldn't smooth. 4, maybe 5 sets of shod hooves, the nail pattern sharp as stars. One horse had cocks. Not many local smiths bothered with those. Been circling slow, Miguel said. His voice carried the gravel of a forge. Not boys looking for strays. These set their mounts and look in your windows. Amigo Silas crouched, palm to heel print just below the sill. The boot had a small half-moon plate screwed on the edge. City work. A sliver of paper had frozen into the crust, tore free in his fingers. He rubbed it and read an ink ghost. Freight and the rest was gone to wet. They stood with the cold plying at their coats. Out beyond the fence, the ridge wire sang one long, clean note like a saw drawn too tight. Inside, Lila had the scarf dry and neat under her chin, color back in her face. She glanced past, them to the yard, and then to the little sliver of wood she'd seen earlier. She took Silas's knife without asking and scraped the frost off the steak. Numbers came up, 12 plus 40S, and a faint arrow. Stationing, she said, breath touching the blade. Survey center line. S for spur, 1,240 feet from some base the engineers picked in town. Her jaw tightened. They mean to run it through Snowshoe Creek and that cut there. Ghost Elk Draw, cleanest grade, cheapest land if they scare you early. Miguel spat a little to one side, aimed and exact. Railroad men. Hands soft, money loud. A knock sounded, 2 and 1 after. Bess Rawlins's pattern since the war. Silas slid the bar, and the widow pushed in with a pie under one arm and a quilt-wrapped length of iron under the other. The wind fussed at her gray hair and lost. She took the room at a glance, her eye falling on the 2 enamel mugs set side by side. "Well now," she said, setting the pie down, "your table looks less like a headstone." She laid the quilt on the boards and peeled it back to show an old coach gun clean as a sermon. "Figured this ought to winter over at your place. It sins less if it's useful." "Much obliged," Silas said. "Oblige me back by not getting righteous when you ought to get low," Bess said, her voice rough and kind at once. "Honor's good." "Don't let it kill you." Lila stepped forward, palms up from the blanket's edge, as if warming them. "Mrs. Rawlins, could you carry something quiet to town?" "Not a letter. Too slow. A note a telegrapher can read without looking like one." Bess lifted a brow. Jed Horn's ears still work. His knees, not so much. "What have you got?" Lila tore a strip from the brown sugar sack and wrote small, sharp marks that weren't quite words. "Q.R.M. at noon, line, high. Jed. Watch G.E. draw. Whitmore name on forged ledger copy, in lining. Bring seal." She dotted the corners like flour in a recipe, then flipped it and wrote 3 harmless lines. "Bake at a hot oven till the top blisters. Don't open the door too soon." Miguel chuckled once. "Woman knows 2 languages with the same pencil." 3, Lila said. "Paper and the kind men wave when they come to take your pasture." Bess slid the strip into her apron. "I'll pin it under my sleeve, right where Jesus can read it first." She looked to Silas. "You want me to send any last words to that windmill of yours?" "Tell it to hold," he said. "Hear that, Lord?" "We're in the request line." She snugged her scarf and gave Lila a measuring nod. "You keep that knot the cowboy showed you." Wind loves a loose throat. They set watches before dusk. Miguel would take the ridge until the first hard dark, then roll into the lean-to and warm his hands on the Ford shovel, while Silas climbed to the loft window. Bess would ride the cut-bank trail light and slow. A pie-basket widow, not worth stopping unless you knew what you were after. Lila set herself at the table with needle and twine, closing a seam in Miguel's coat and a rent in the blanket he'd leave on the ridge. Silas moved through the cabin with a care that came of choosing it. He greased the door latch so it'd lift quiet, drove a second peg into the rear step where frost had heaved it proud, and laid a short length of braided rope by the back jamb. Lila watched his hands and nodded like a teacher pleased without needing to speak it. When Bess left, she stood in the door and sniffed the weather like a stock dog. "Storm's done its say," she judged. "Now men'll try theirs." She touched 2 fingers to Silas's sleeve. "Keep your head down. Keep your name clean." It was the same tune his mother had hummed in spring, and for a beat it put a weight in his chest. They ate by the stove, quiet, but not the old kind of quiet. The extra mug had a thumbprint of coffee down one side now, the glaze crazed like ice on a puddle. Lila's shoulder had settled. She stirred stew with her left hand and kept glancing at the window the way a wire operator glances at a key even when it's still. "Listen," Miguel said later, flattening his palm to the sill. They listened. The ridge wire didn't sing now so much as hum, a low, steady thing. Down valley, beyond the first fold of white, a hairline of smoke wrote itself against the pale, thin, straight, not a rancher's driftwood stack, but dry willow and coal oil. It lifted from the mouth of Ghost Elk Draw and then tore off sideways. When the wind took interest, Silas felt the look Lila gave him without turning to meet it. He reached for his coat. The night took a breath the way men do before speaking their piece. They let the dark settle right up to the window glass before they spoke plain. The stove ticked. The wire on the ridge went from a sing to a hum. You felt more in the bones than in the ears. Miguel's shape moved now and then along the loft slit, a shadow that breathed. Lila sat with her hands flat on the table, sleeves shoved to the elbows like work was the only truth worth telling. "Sila," she said, steady, "you deserve the rest of it." He waited. "Charles Whitmore," she went on, "railroad comptroller. Smiles like a pastor, steals like a crow. He ran money through my office, doctored figures, then left my name standing where his ought to be. That lets him come at you two ways, papers and pistols, right of way through Snowshoe. Cheap if folks are scared, free if they're dead." Silas felt the slow set of his jaw. "And your wire to your lawyer, near Ghost Elk Draw," she said, not blinking. "I might as well have nailed a sign to your fence." "I thought I was telling one man I was safe. I told the wrong men where to hunt." Nothing in the room moved but the fire. He looked at the extra mug, then back at her. "You knew the stakes were high?" "I know the marks," she said, "and the kind of men they send. They'll come talking first. They always do." He nodded once. "Then we set our talking in order." Lila drew a breath and let it out slow, like a telegrapher easing a key. "I have a plan," she said. "It isn't pretty, but it's quiet." "Say it." "First," she said, "we use what the wind gives." "Ash." She pointed to the scuttle by the stove. "Sift it. Keep it dry. When they ride up and the gust hits the porch, I throw a panful high. It'll lift a gray curtain. Their aim goes to smoke." "Ours doesn't." Miguel's voice came down from the loft, low as leather. "Bueno." "Second," Lila said, already on her feet, "we move the side stove to the back door. Just a foot. Stack kindling so it throws light like a man standing. We hang the decoy lantern in the front window and shade this table. If they choose a silhouette, it won't be ours." Silas slid the stove a handspan, then another, iron legs squeaking until he greased the feet with tallow. He lifted the lantern and wrapped one side with a scrap of canvas until the light fell where Lila wanted it, into emptiness. "Third," she said, "grease everything that cries. Hinges, floor seams, even the latch. No gifts to their ears." He cut tallow with his knife, and they worked in tandem, heel of his palm on the door hardware, while she rubbed a thin shine along the floorboards that liked to complain. The smell of lanolin and iron smoke filled the cabin. Work settled their shoulders. "Fourth," she said, picking up the braided rope he'd laid by the jam, "we make a tripping string." "There," she set it waist high between the back corner of the house and a fence post and dusted it with snow so it learned to disappear. "If a man comes quick thinking to circle us, he eats the yard." Silas brought a short cedar stake and drove it home to brace the line. He tugged once. It thrummed like a small wire. "Fifth," she said, softer now, and looked to the coat, hanging by the peg. "Papers. I have carbon copies of Whitmore's ledgers sewn into this lining. If we live to morning, Jed Horn will have what the court needs. If we don't—" She swallowed. "Bess knows where I stitch them." He touched the coat with 2 fingers as if it were a person. "We'll see Jed," he said, "in one piece." They worked on without hurry. He shifted the table 2 inches away from the window so a ricochet wouldn't find a knee. She folded blankets in squares to make a pallet behind the bed where a human curve wouldn't show. He set the shotgun open on the bench and thumbed fresh brass into the loops. She checked the cap box, counted out cartridges, and laid them in a row like dominoes. When they had made the little changes that turn a house into a position, he brewed coffee and poured it into both mugs. She wrapped her fingers around hers, and the steam fogged the slice of glass that hadn't yet cracked from the cold. "I'm sorry," she said at last, not dressing it in prettier cloth, "for bringing it down on you." He took a sip. Bitter sat right on a man's tongue on nights like this. "Storms come whether you write them or not," he said. "We just set the doors." Something eased in her shoulders. "A telegraph line only tells you what's already in the wire," she said. "You still choose what you'll send back?" He held her gaze. It didn't run this time. Outside, the wind leaned on the cabin, and the boards leaned right back. Miguel came down the ladder like a cat, quiet despite the cold stiffening his coat. "Ridge is clear for now," he said, "but there's a taste in the air like iron." "Then we eat and rest in turns," Silas said. "You take first bowl, I'll mind the door. Lila, I'll mind the ash," she said, and set the pan by the threshold. She lifted the pocket mirror from her reticule and slipped it into her sleeve. "If Jed finds the ridge, I can give him a blink to move on." "Ma'am," Silas said, "it came easy." "Dizzy." They doused lamps until the room was shadow and stove glow. Wind nosed the eave. The roof slab answered with a long, tight groan and held, a white weight waiting its hour. Far off, the ridge wire hummed like a low string. Closer, three men listened to a house practice being brave. They heard the hooves before they saw shapes, iron biting crust, slow and sure like men counting. Silas eased to the jam. The greased hinge made no word of it. Lila stood to his left with the ash pan under one arm, scarf set snug, mirror tucked in her sleeve. Miguel took the loft slit, rifle across the sill, breath fanning pale. 4 riders came out of the white and arranged themselves 30 yards off, as if a surveyor had put them there. Coats too clean for this country, new gloves, slick black tack. The lead man sat a bay with a curb bit bright as coin. Hat brim straight, jaw shaved, a wool scarf knotted like a banker's tie. "Whitmore," Lila breathed, no fear in it, only fact. He lifted a hand at the way a pastor calls a room to order. "Householder," he called, voice polished to carry. "Charles Whitmore, Comptroller, Northern and Continental. We've business as men. Send out Miss Davenport and any papers she's purloined. We'll trouble you no further." Silas set his shoulder to the post and let the door frame hold him up. "This land don't hang a Chicago sign." Whitmore smiled, a church smile. A fine joke in fair weather. Today we speak in law." He raised a leather folio and shook out sheets that snapped in the wind. "Writs, affidavits, a notice of right-of-way. Your creek and that draw make for clean grade. Territory wants progress. I bring it behind him." One of the riders let his coat fall back off his gun elbow. Miguel's sight never left the man's chest. Whitmore's eyes went to the window, where the decoy lantern threw a man-tall glow against the empty wall. "You alone in there?" he asked. "Or did the city girl teach you company you can't keep?" Silas didn't bite. "You step your horses back off my fence." Whitmore's smile thinned. "Miss Davenport," he called, turning his head a fraction, enough for his voice to find her name. "You're a wanted woman. You stole from decent men. Don't make this rancher drown with you." Lila lifted her chin where he couldn't see. "He lies as easy as he breathes," she said, under the hiss of what was the wind. Silas let his own voice ride level. "You've said your paper piece. Here's mine. You ain't taking her. You ain't taking my draw. Turn your stock and go." Whitmore sat quiet a long count, measuring which way the world would lean. He looked past the cabin, up toward the ridge, where the wire sang low and mean. A dark comma moved against the skyline and was gone, nothing to a man who didn't know Jed Horn's size and habit. Whitmore's glove creaked on his reins. Last offer, he said, and the church was out of his tone now. Walk her out with her hands where we can see. Toss your long gun. I'll count to 3 because I am civilized. He held up 2 fingers, dropped one. Lila's hand found Silas's wrist and pressed once, ready. He nodded without looking her way. 1. Wind shouldered the cabin. The roof slab above them groaned a deep warning. 2. Lila stepped forward, swung the pan, and pitched Ash high into the oncoming gust. The gray went up like a curtain tearing loose, feather fine, then thick as smoke. It rolled across the yard and swallowed the riders' knees, their cinches, their hands. 3. The decoy lantern threw a bright man shape in the front window. The first muzzle out there twitched toward the light that wasn't a life. Inside, floorboards stayed quiet under greased seams. Miguel's breath slowed to a hunter's count. Lila's fingers found the pocket mirror in her sleeve and tipped it once toward the ridge. Blink and gone. Whitmore shifted in the saddle, trying to see through weather, the color of lead. Have it your way, he said. His voice turned hard as the day. Silas set the butt of the rifle into the notch he'd rasped in the jam years back for storm work, and felt the notch take him true. The ash hissed along the eave like sand on a river bar. Every sound drew tight. The world balanced on the thin place between breath and shot. The first shot came crooked through ash and hit the decoy wall where the lantern threw a man that wasn't there. Plaster dust bloomed and fell. Silas answered once, clean, and the bay under Whitmore danced sidewise, iron striking iron. The ash curtain turned the yard to a gray room with no corners. Miguel's rifle spoke from the loft slit. 2 fast, 1 held. A hat jumped off a head and vanished into swirl. Downrange, a hired man swore and fired blind. Powder stung the nose. Ash got between the teeth and squeaked. Wind shouldered the eave. The roof slab above them gave a long, tired groan and let go. Snow came down in one white breath, slammed the porch rail, and slid hard off the far edge. It clipped the windmill with the clean crack of a green limb breaking. The vane spun free half the turn, wobbled, then sheared. The pump rod thunked and went quiet. "Water's out," Silas said to nobody, because saying it made the cost sit where he could see it. A muzzle flared in the ash at horse belly height. Something sewed hot along Silas's ribs and jerked him back a step. The world pinched to a point and widened again. He palmed the wound, wet, then quickly colder than the room. He set his shoulder to the jam and stayed. "Down!" Lila snapped and dragged the ashpan low, throwing a second veil when the gust turned, feeding the gray the way a stove takes kindling. Her scarf knot held. She moved like she was working a board, not in fear, but to time. A rider tried the flank, skirting the corral where the wind died under the lee. He came fast, thinking to be past the corner before the house could pivot. His horse hit the braided rope Lila had set and folded at the knees as if the ground had been jerked up. Man and tack went forward in a mingled piece. Silas was already moving. He took the tail of that same rope, set a boot, and heaved. The man hit hard and stayed, air knocked clean out of him. Silas tied what needed tying without a word and slid back to the door, one hand pressed to his coat, where the graze was beginning to shine like a frost line. Miguel's voice came flat from the loft. "One left side, one right. Whitmore in the middle, hold him in the middle," Silas said, and shot the left. The ash opened a brief throat to show a shoulder and a bit of sleeve. His bullet found cloth, then meat. The man howled and rocked backward, firing into nowhere as he slid off the saddle. Lila knelt by the stair and worked the old coach gun open. Brass winked. She fed shells with steady fingers, thumbs sure. "Miguel," she called, and when he reached without looking, she laid the shotgun into his grip and pushed up his sleeve with her other hand. Blood slicked his coat at the seam like lamp oil. She jammed a folded strip of scarf into the hole and leaned on it with the heel of her palm. "Through and through," she judged, voice low. "You're still handsome." Miguel bared his teeth. "Always." She tore another strip with her teeth and bound it fast. Then she slid the mirror out of her sleeve and caught a sliver of lantern light, flashing it twice toward the ridge where Jed Horn would be if Jed Horn was worth his badge. Flash. Count. Flash. Gone. "Enough," Whitmore called, but his voice had lost its varnish. He moved the bay 2 steps like a man who didn't want to show he was moving at all. "This is law you're spitting on." Silas didn't answer. He put another round where the right-hand rider's elbow had been a blink before and shaved leather. The man thought better of the angle and pulled away, coughing ash. Farther off, the ridge gave back a sound that didn't belong to wind. Jed's long gun once. The bay skittered. Whitmore turned the curb too hard, iron cruel, in a mouth used to easy hands. Horse and man slid a yard on the iron-hard crust. The bay found footing again. Whitmore's boot didn't. His heels skated, and he went down on his side, folio flying, papers smacking, flat to the snow, and ghosting off on the gust. He clawed for the stirrup, missed, and slid toward the slicked edge of the porch path where melt had glazed and frozen again. Silas was out the door before thinking that he was. The greased latch blessed him with quiet. His ribs complained. He put a hand there to keep them company and went anyway. He caught Whitmore's coat at the armpit. Just as the man's gloved fingers lost the last of the crust and started for the drop to the hard-packed yard, Whitmore was heavier than he looked. Money weight, paper weight. Silas set his boots and hauled. "Let me fall and be done," Whitmore hissed, pride sharp as broken glass. "Not how we do it," Silas said, and dragged him back onto honest footing. "Hands where I can see 'em," Marshal Jed Horn said from 10 paces, his coat pulled to the wind, and his badge dull as a winter sun. The old man had come up under the edge of the ash, with the patience of a fence post growing out of ground. His carbine didn't waver. Whitmore showed his palms. They were clean like he kept them. His jaw worked once. "On your knees," Jed said, and when Whitmore hesitated, he added almost kindly, "Don't make me kneel you." Whitmore went down onto the white. Jed stepped in neat 1-2 and turned a wrist the wrong way with a sound a man doesn't forget. The irons clicked with a homely little bite. Lila let out a breath she'd been holding so long it made her light-headed. Out by the corral, the tripped rider groaned into his scarf. The wounded one staggered toward his mount, chose instead to flee on Almos's feet when Miguel's shadow filled the loft, cut with a new shell in the pipe. The last horseman saw too much and skittered his animal backward, then spun it and ran it for the smoke hairline at the mouth of Ghost Elk Draw. Ash thinned in the yard and went to ground like gray rain. Silence came in pieces. Silas stood with his hand at his ribs, feeling the cold take the blood and make it a stiff place. Lila was at him before he swayed. "Sit," she ordered, and when he didn't, she put a palm flat on his chest and made him. She sliced his coat with the same tidy push she used on paper, found the furrow, and set pressure with bandage and will. "It's deep and mean, but not mortal," she said, and her eyes were wet without spilling. "Hold still." He held. He could taste iron and ash and the faint sweetness of tallow. Jed hauled Whitmore to his feet and turned him toward the dark trail to town. "You'll regret this," Whitmore said, voice gone small now that the church was out of it. "Likely," Jed said. "Men regret all sorts of right things." Walk the windmill stood with one vein missing, the tower leaning a hair more than it had at noon. The pump rod hung dumb. It would be work and more money than Silas had set aside to fix. Miguel's sleeve was stiff with blood. Lila's hands shook for the first time since the writers showed. Silas felt every almost year he'd earned and the ones he hadn't yet. Price paid, he thought, and then he thought of the extra mug cooling on the table and the mirror tucked back in Lila's sleeve, and he decided it was the sort a man could live with. The ash settled. The house stood. The wire on the ridge hummed low as if it too had spent itself and now wanted only quiet. Jed Horn didn't linger. He bound Whitmore's wrists with leather thongs under the irons. Cold makes steel burn, and walked him to the sorrel he'd borrowed off Bess for work that took a spine. "You'll ride in," Jed said, "or you'll ride over my saddle." "Choose the one with dignity." Miguel slid down from the loft, white around the mouth but standing on his own temper. Lila had his shoulder wrapped tight and neat, not high so it wouldn't bite the wound. She pressed a palm to Silas's bandage once more, felt the seep slow under her hand, and nodded to herself, like a nurse in a field tent. "Papers," Jed said. Lila took her coat from its peg. The lining opened under her small knife with a whisper. She drew out flat packets wrapped in oiled cloth, carbon copies black as stove soot, figures and signatures set backwards and sure. "Ledger pages from the St. Paul office," she said. "Double books." Money flowed out through Whitmore contingency and back in under other men's names. "See the loops on the H?" She tapped the flourish with a fingernail. "That's his hand when he's in a hurry." Jed's breath plumed. He laid the pages across the table edge, far from the stove's spatter, and read, with lips moving just enough to prove it. Enough ink to drown a man, he judged. He slid the stack into an empty flour sack, folded it twice, and dripped candle wax across the mouth. From his pocket he produced a small brass seal, the color of old corn. He pressed it down. The wax took the badge print clean. "Chain of custody," he said, to the room and the Lord both. "Exhibit A, ledgers, Davenport. Exhibit B, wire to St. Paul to confirm wire," Lila said. Jed tipped his chin at the ridge. "Town's close enough when the man's with a man. Deputy Howe waits at the key this time of year. He sleeps light." He glanced at Whitmore. "He ain't the only one." They went out into a night the storm had scraped clean. Stars like rock salt. The ash that had draped the yard lay thin and gray, a tired snowfall. Whitmore swung to the saddle with care he didn't bother to hide. Pride rides worse with cold wrists. "Give me an hour," Jed told Silas. "2 if Howe's got to wake the operator. Put coffee on either way. We'll have company or we won't." They heard them go down valley, hoof iron on frozen ground, a sound like nails in a lid until it wasn't. Inside, Lila set the ledger's carbon skins on the bench, as if the wood had sense and would keep them safe. She wiped the knife. Silas eased his coat closed and took the stove lid with the poker, feeding one more split to the glow. The room drew in around the 3 of them, warm as they could make it, honest as hands. They patched what could be patched. Miguel soldered a split-lantern chimney with a smear of tin and a curse in Spanish that sounded like a prayer if you weren't fluent. Lila skimmed the ledger copies for gaps, wrote names on a scrap. Banks, dates, the small lies that make the big ones stand. Silas wiped blood from the jam with a damp cloth and set the cloth to boil after. A house has to forget certain things on purpose. Bess came before dawn, breath smoking, skirts frosted like they'd been dredged. She put a small parcel on the table. "Biscuits," she said, but the paper had the feel of telegraph about it. Jed and Deputy Howe shouldered through right behind. The old man's face had the look of a fence post that had taken wind all night and still thought well of itself. He lifted a strip of yellow paper by the corner. "STPIUL office. Confirms signatures on transfers to contingency are forged. Receiving accounts traced to Charles Whitmore, N and C. Warrant authorized upon presentation. E.M. Kelly, supervisor. Howe, young and ring-eyed, set his gloves to steam on the back of a chair and grinned like a schoolboy allowed to sit with men. Operator banged that key like a woodpecker, he said. Kelly don't sleep either. Jed tucked the wire into the sealed sack with the ledgers and pressed another coin of wax across the knot. Exhibit C. Confirmation St. Paul, he said. He pulled a foolscap from his coat and wrote slow block letters that had carried 100 miles of winter without falling over. Sworn statement, he told them, and read as he wrote. On the 8th day of January, 1887, at Snowshoe Creek, I, Jedediah Horn, duly sworn marshal for this district, did take into custody one Charles Whitmore, on probable cause to believe him guilty of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to obtain right-of-way by unlawful means. He finished, signed, and had Lila lay her hand on the Bible for form's sake. Her voice didn't shake when she swore. He sealed that paper too. Whitmore stood with his back to the stove, as far as the irons allowed, trying to peel heat out of it, with the face he used on juries. He watched the wax take Jed's seal and smiled a slow, small smile that said, "Men with paper can beat men with paper." "Elena's a long way," he said. "Roads break. Judges get called home by weather. Exhibits go missing. Bess thumped the coach gun stock on the floor once. Men do too," she said. Miguel's sleeve had gone brown where red had been. He raised his mug to Leela. "Senorita," he said, "your mirror brought the law. Your ash saved my other shoulder. I owe you a pair." "Bring your shirt," she said, businesslike. "I'll stitch that seam before you go bragging it open." Jed cinched his coat. "We load up," he said. "Howe and me, Whitmore between. We'll stable at Rollins's to warm the horses, then push through East Ridge and drop to the river. From there it's only cold and patience." "What about the draw?" Silas asked. Jed nodded toward Ghost Elk. "We walked a chunk of ore out of that cut on the way in," he said. Lila took the dark lump in both hands. It stained her glove gray. When Miguel tapped it with the butt of his knife, it broke easy, glittering a little, and then not at all. "Tailings," Jed said. "Old shovels leavings. Scarecrow to shake land cheap. Ain't worth a man's breath." "So the rumor dies," Bess said. "Somebody tell the valley." "They'll hear," Jed said. "Men always hear money's gone." He turned to Lila. "You riding with us?" "Safer under a badge till Helena." Lila glanced at the two enamel mugs, at the windmill's busted vein through the window, at the work yet to do that looked like living. She shook her head once. "I'll send my statement by Howe. I'll come later for the hearing." Her eyes slid to Silas and stayed. "I owe this cabin something first." Jed didn't smile exactly, but the corners of his mouth thought about it. "Suit yourself. Keep your door greased and your lamp low." He palmed the sealed sack. "Ink and seal, Mr. Aboon," he said. "Not just smoke." "Appreciate it," Silas said, and meant the simple words. They tramped out, Whitmore between them, like a stump being moved because it stood where a gate ought to be. The morning had the color of cold iron. Hooves thudded into packed snow and shrank to nothing down valley. Silas shut the door and lifted the bar. Lila leaned her forehead to the wood a breath, then turned and set her shoulders to the small work. "We'll need glass for the window," she said, "and a new vein. And coffee," he said, because that was paper too, the kind a man signs with his hands. He poured. Steam climbed and fogged the pane, blurring the broken windmill into a softer thing than it was. The wire on the ridge hummed low, not talking so much as listening. Ink and seal had done their part. Now came mending, which is a kind of law a house keeps by itself. Morning came colorless and work-shaped. They set to it without speeches, Snow from the slide lay hunched along the porch like a busted whale. Silas took the square shovel and cut it into blocks, heaving them over the rail. With a grunt that fogged the air, Lila hauled with him, skirts pinned high, boots laced tight. When the blade rang stone, she shifted to broom, sweeping shards of window glass into a feed sack so no boot would find them later. "Hold the sash," she said, and he did while she bedded the new pane Bess had brought from town. Odd size, but she trimmed a wood shim with Silas's knife until it sat true. Putty under her thumb smoothed clean. She wiped the smear with a rag, patient as a seamstress. "Wind will still gossip," she said, "but it won't spit." They buried the bay mare at the cottonwood, where the ground thawed shallow near the roots. Miguel swung the mattock one-handed, jaw pieta against the tug in his bandaged shoulder. Silas broke crust with a bar, struck sparks on stone, lifted and didn't stop until the hole said enough. Lila set the bridle folded on the mare's withers and laid a palm to the cold neck, a last time. "Good horse," she said. No bigger eulogy was needed. Snow filled quiet around the mound. Bess stood off with her old shotgun on her arm, like a church lady holds a hymnal. "This country takes the proud first," she said, "and the rest if you give it time. Eat hot when we're done." Back at the windmill, the truth of the break showed itself plain, vane gone clean, hinge strap twisted, pump rod sulking. Miguel warmed the strap in the little forge by the lean-to, the fire a tight blue lick in the cold. "Won't be pretty," he said, "but pretty don't pull water." He hammered with the flat, counted beats, quenched, and handed the part with tongs. Silas climbed, leather belt around his waist and the tower, ribs singing each rung. Lila steadied the ladder with both hands, face tipped up into stinging flakes, set free by the lightest wind. "Say when," she called. "When," he said, breath short, and drove the bolts through, coal bit metal, metal bit back. He snugged the nut, wiped his glove, and gave the vane a cautious push. It turned. The pump rod answered with a stubborn thunk, then found the old up and down like a heart resuming. He closed his eyes a beat at that sound. Inside, the stove popped its approval. Lila brewed coffee, darker than townfolk like, a whisper of cinnamon for heat that wasn't the stove's. She tested the pour, tasted, and added a pinch of grounds back into the pot to settle the grit, the way old operators did when the key chattered too fast. She set the enamel mug side by side and filled both to the same line. He took a sip. "Just right," he said, and then, surprising himself, "Thank you." The words felt new and at his mouth, and good. She smiled without showing teeth. "You're welcome, Silas." They did the small work that stitches a winter, oiled the latch again, rehung the door quilt, mended the terror in Miguel's coat with twine waxed in tallow. Lila thumbed through the herd book and tallied cattle, her figures square and simple, no room for Whitmore's flourishes. She penciled a note in the margin where a calf had gone missing, frozen, no fault. Silas watched her write it and felt something in his chest unclench. Toward noon, she pulled on her other coat, the one with no ledger sewn in it, and tied a scarf so the knot sat easy under her chin. "I told Howe I'd take a few hours at the key," she said. "Operator needs a relief, and word travels straighter when I'm there to hear it. I'll be back on the night train, if it runs, else I'll walk the ridge with a lantern." Silas looked at the repaired pane, the windmill's cautious rhythm through the extra mug, not lonely any more. He nodded. "Cabin'll be warm," he said. "Lamp low. Hinge quiet." Bess watched from the doorway, the weather living in on her bones. "Girl, you ride careful," she said. "Men are polite till they ain't. If somebody tips his hat too deep, show him you're straight, back, and keep going." "Yes, ma'am," Lila said, and the ma'am sat in her mouth like a promise rather than a fence. Miguel lifted his chin. "Bring back wire talk," he said. "I like to hear when bad men sweat." She tapped her temple. "I'll bring it in my head." "Paper can wait." She paused, then looked to Silas, weighing town against here the way folks weigh weather. "You need anything?" He thought of 100 wants and paired them to what fit in a house that had learned to speak plain. "Just you back through the dark," he said. She tugged her glove, brushed his sleeve with 2 fingers in a touch that meant more because it was small, and went. Afternoon laid a poor shine on the snow, a nickel light. Silas and Miguel fixed what else could be fixed. The back step where frost had heaved, the corral rail a horse had worried loose, the split in the grain bin. They worked with the old rhythm of men who don't ask if a thing can be done, so long as it needs doing. When the ridge wire lifted a little tune, Miguel grinned. "She's at the key." Dusk found the cabin trimmed to rights. Silas set 2 bowls, 2 spoons, and the extra mug. Without thinking, like a man who has stopped counting ghosts, he cleaned his mother's Bible with a damp rag, not reading still, but setting it square. He laid a folded quilt where a second pair of boots would leave melt. The latch lifted just past full dark with the soft sound of good grease. Lila stepped in with her cheeks struck pink by the air and a flour sack under her arm. "Glass tacks, 2 panes spare, and a letter for Bess from her cousin," she reported. Also, the key said Helena set a date to hear Whitmore. "The law's awake." "Good," Silas said. The one word did the work of 10. She hung her coat, shook out her scarf, and went to the stove like she'd done it all her life. Steam rose, the window fogged to butter paper, hiding the windmill and the hard world beyond. They ate as people do who've earned it, quiet, with the scrape of spoons and the smell of pepper and coffee, making the room honest. Now and then their knees touched under the table, not by accident and not yet by design. It was enough. "Thank you," Silas said again, before the night got all the way in. It came easier. "You're welcome," she answered, and when she looked at him, the room felt bigger than the storm had left it. The ridge wire hummed low, not a warning anymore, more like a lullaby a hard country hums when it decides a man and a woman might get to keep what they've held. The house remembered less glass and more voices. The extra mug at last had company. Dawn came slow, a pale seam under the ridge. The cold held tight enough to make the boards speak when they shifted. Silas eased the door and stepped onto the porch with his coat open at the throat to test the day. His breath went up in a white plume. Another plume joined it a heartbeat later. Lila, blanket over her shoulders, hair tucked into a knit cap somebody's hands had made long ago. "Looks less mean this morning," she said. "Means tired," he answered. "That helps." The windmill clicked once and fell into a steady beat. The pump rod finding work like a heart, remembering how, from the corral, came the slow rip of hay, cattle grateful and saying so in their way. A magpie hopped along the cottonwood mound where they'd buried the bay mare, black and white formal against the snow, and flew when Lila lifted her hand. They stood without hurry. The cold pinched Silas's rib where the graze lay under the bandage. Not sharp now, only a reminder he was still rented to this world. Lila's fingers worked the blanket edge, then let it go. She smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the faint iron of new window putty. "Jed set a hearing for Whitmore," she said. "Helena in 2 weeks. How will wire when the judge sits?" "You'll go," Silas said. "I will." She looked at the valley as if it were a face she'd decided to learn. "And I'll come back." He nodded, a small thing that meant more than a talk could carry. They stepped inside before the cold found the cracks in their good sense. The stove ticked its welcome. Lila moved easy in the small kitchen, pouring coffee dark and clean. She put the enamel mugs down side by side so their rims lined up like 2 buttons on the same coat. Silas took his and sipped. Just right. She set her own down and put both palms flat on the table as if to steady a thought. "I've got a question needs asking straight," she said. "I can take work at the quay regular, half days most days. The rest I can put here. There's herd books to clean, hinges to hush, fences to mend. If—" She stopped, not for fear but to make room for plain words. "If you want that." He let the stove fill the pause. He looked at the window. The new pane fogged where the room ran warm against the morning. He looked at the door, hinge quiet, latch greased. He looked at the second mug and the thumbprint that would not wash out of its glaze, a mark that made it theirs. Then he looked at her. "Stay through spring grass," he said, slow so he wouldn't say more than he could keep. "Maybe a season after if it suits. We'll see what the place looks like with 2 sets of hands on it." Relief came to her face like light under clouds. Not a smile first. Something softer, older than that. Then the smile came too, small and true. "All right." They set to chores that didn't need witnesses. He fed stove lengths from the stacked split pine and fixed the door quilt where it had sagged. She penned a letter to the St. Paul office in a hand neat enough to serve as evidence all by itself. Brief, factual, no heat wasted. They walked the fence to the creek bend where ice boomed under snow, and he showed her where spring seeped when the thaw finally bothered to cross the ridge. She marked it on the little ranch map he'd kept scratched on brown paper, writing spring where he'd always just known. Toward noon, Bestin with a crock of beans that had seen bacon and a joke about men needing supervision. Miguel followed later, hat in his hand, shoulder stiff but eyes bright. They ate at the crowded table, hands brushing, when bowls changed owners, the room warmer than the stove alone could claim credit for. Talk ran small and decent. Fence staples, a cow that favored her near leg, the price of glass in January. When it turned to Helena and judges and chain of custody, the talk stayed clean. Paper had done right by them once. It could again. After they left, the cabin fell quiet in a way that wasn't empty. Lila stood by the window and watched the windmill turn. Silas came beside her without crowding. Outside, a thin light lay on the flats like a promise a man could take or leave. He set his knuckles gently against hers on the sill. She didn't move away. "You ever think on how a place keeps a man?" she asked. "Most days," he said. "Sometimes a person keeps it too." She tipped her head, considering the truth of that. He turned his hand so their fingers could fit better. No hurry, no theater, just the fit. Toward evening, the sky and I took on a color that wasn't quite blue and wasn't quite steel. They stepped out once more, breath went up in twin white braids and drifted apart and then together again. Down in the draw, a thin-faced calf bumped its mother and got what it asked for. Far off, a coyote set a single note on the air and left it there, not hungry enough for a chorus. Silas touched the doorpost as he went back in, the way a man tips his hat to a friend. Lila set the lamp low and laid 2 bowls and 2 spoons and 2 mugs, as if it had always been that way. He took his place. She took hers. The wire on the ridge didn't sing now, it listened. Living, he thought, ain't the same as living alone. He didn't say it. He let the room say it for him. The steady stove, the quiet hinge, the sound of 2 people eating what they'd earned. Spring would find them when it could. Until then there was this, white breath on cold mornings, work to share, a hand that didn't flinch, and a house that at last spoke in more than one voice. That's our trail for today. Quiet hands, clean paper, and a house that finally speaks in 2 voices. If this kind of winter healing sits right with you, drop a 0 to say you felt it or a 1 if you want more. Saddle up with the channel, subscribe, and ride along for the next campfire story under the wide, cold sky.